now, because we don't want to run late and try to get off the transit and everything, so we try to be on time, so it's not too stressful for some of us. Well, thank you for being here. First of all, it's really great to have people come in on a Saturday and being interested in disability and law in Quebec. So I'm going to start. My name is Laurence Parent. I'm a PhD candidate at Concordia University in Humanities, and I'm passionate about disability and disability history. So before Melanie's presentation about the law and disability in Quebec and in other legislation, I'm going to do a short presentation about the history and disability activism that happened before the adoption of the law in 1978, just to recognize, just to have a better understanding of what happened before. On the first slide of my presentation, you see a picture of Maria Barillo. She was a disabled feminist who fought for disabled people, disabled women's rights in Quebec and Canada. She's one of the co-founders of Action des Femmes Handicapées de Montréal, of Down Raft Canada, and she has been very important for me, for my work and my own interest in disability. And the picture that besides Maria, she's sitting in a manual wheelchair, and there's police officers around her, trying to, she was participating in the protest in 1988 for the accessibility of the metro, and she was arrested for being there. So there's many police officers around her. And this is something that is part of that our history that we never really talked about. So I think that this is important to talk about it. So going back to before a long time ago, that period called the Great Darkness, La Grande Noirceur. So on the Maurice Duplessis, the power of the church that was extremely important at that time. Many disabled people were kept in institutions, so they were not part of the community. And if they were part, living at home, it was really based on their own family support, or maybe the church support or charity support, but the state was not really involved at that time. So a lot of mistreatments in institutions, of course. It still exists in some CHSLD. People were not always treated well. Well, you can imagine how it was at that time of their history. It was extremely difficult, and disability was still seen as something, like a tragedy, a private matter, something that we should be ashamed of. Here I have a quote from Montreal Mayor Camille Hood in 1947. He launched a charity campaign for crippled children. Both words were used at that time. And it goes like this: those who are afflicted by an infirmity belong to a category of miserables. So it can give you an idea of how it was at that time. The movement called the Great Exit is when some disabled people started to get out of the institutions. We know that movement, maybe more for people receiving like psychiatric treatment. That movement that people were kicked out of the institutions and then left in society without proper services. Well, disabled people also experience that movement, but it's not as well known in popular culture. So the Commission Castonguay group, which has been very important for the establishment of the Régie de l'assurance maladie, the public healthcare system in Quebec, also recognized that disabled people were like citizens, which is like, of course, for us it's obvious, but at that time it was not as obvious as it is today. But disabled people had started trying to be part of the community, realized that there were a lot of obstacles. For example, access to, of course, education, transportation, and also people that have a lot of negative attitudes towards disabled people, a lot of pity and everything. And of course, we still see those kind of attitudes now. But at that time, yeah, nothing was put in place for disabled people. So, for example, for transportation, paratransit adapted transport didn't at that time. So it clearly became clear that the Quebec government needed to legislate. But then the question is, how would they legislate? What would the law look like? So in 1976, the bill for 55 was submitted by the Robert government. At that time, it was on a bill on the protection of the handicapped. So disabled people at that time were involved in some disability organizations. So it's just the beginning of the disability rights movement. Um, most of them agreed that we didn't want to be protected. They wanted to be recognized as citizens, and they were not handicapped, and they were not unsteady. They were people that some unsteady. So a lot of memoirs were sent to the government. 33 memoirs were sent in 1976, but only 5 of them were written by disability rights organizations. The movement was just starting, and the medical model of disability was still very present, even for people advocating for disabled people with that. At that time, it was still, we should do something because it's not their fault, something like that, but not really based on the social model of disability. And here I have a quote that I translated myself this morning, so it's probably not in very good English, but it's the Association du Québec pour l'investissement mentaux. They were against the new bill, and they say, we argue that the Office des personnes handicapées du Québec, as it is presented to us right now, will be another bureaucratic structure. Such an organization will not be able to protect disabled people's rights. It will also be another obstacle for the citizens we want to help. Because one of the things that the law was wanted to do, and Melanie will talk about it more later, is the creation of the Office des personnes handicapées, which is a government organization that is supposed to promote disabled people's rights. And then the year after, Madame Bourassa government was defeated and René Lévesque government was elected. So a new government means a new bill. So it was a bill 9, and many things changed. One of the big differences is that the word like protection was left out, and handicapé was left out too, such as personnes handicapées, disabled, people with disabilities. But still, there were people like interested Melanie is going to talk about it. But of course, a lot of the agreements were not taken into consideration. And on June 23rd of 1978, the Loi Assurant l'exercice de droit des personnes handicapées, the law ensuring the rights of people with disabilities, was unanimously adopted by the Assemblée nationale du Québec. So I just wanted to put like us in a context that people at that time were not all very enthusiastic about the adoption of that law, but some of them were, but the movement was really different at that time. So it's just interesting part of our history. So now it's Melanie's turn. She's gonna give her presentation. And what we did during the French presentation is that people just asked the question as Melanie was presenting. I wanted to with
that's fine. I'm just trying to find.
It's on the table there.
Well, and I apologize in advance. We have left an hour and a half in between the French presentation and the English presentation, but I think it's a great thing. There was so much enthusiasm with the French presentation that we were having a discussion and answering questions right up until people arrived for the English presentation. Unfortunately, that means that I have not had the chance to take a break or eat anything. And so I will do my best, but I'm afraid that my energy is running a little bit low. Just going to get my slides open here.
It's okay.
Yes,
It is.
okay. So it's also a bit chaotic getting here today. Unfortunately, a few weeks ago, I was attending another meeting about the lack of accessibility in Montreal, and as I was leaving the building, I tripped on a big hole in the sidewalk. It was about a foot and a half or 2 feet by 2 feet, a few inches deep, and it had a metal post sticking out of it about 4 inches. That I went flying and injured my knee. I'm still waiting for the results of the x-rays, but they think that I have cracked my kneecap a bit. So I'm intermittently having a lot of trouble walking, and I smashed myself on, and it's just another good example of the fact that accessibility is not taken into account really in anything that's done in this city. So I think I recognize a few people here from McGill. That's where I did my studies. But so thank you so much for coming out today, especially on a Saturday. I know the law can seem rather intimidating, and lawyers seem to love using big words and making things sound way more complicated than they actually need to be. And how can you make sure if you don't apply the law and to make it more accessible as it is? By giving a quick overview of the legal system in Canada. This is some basic information I would have loved to have had given to me before I started law school. So people did political science degrees or something, or maybe grew up in families with lawyers. Maybe this was good information they already had, but I think it's really important sort of foundational information to have. I'll then look at Quebec's disability-specific law and show how it compares to the laws in place elsewhere, such as Ontario and the United States. And I'll conclude by presenting a series of recommendations for disability law reform in Quebec. So here goes a crash course in the law in about half an hour. Don't worry, there won't be an exam or a ruling or a judgment at the end of my presentation. Well, Canada is a federal state. This basically means that political power is divided between the federal and the provincial governments. So the federal government can make laws regarding things such as banking, the postal service, and the military, and the provinces can make laws on property and local matters, basically, civil law within the province. And unlike the rest of the country, Quebec has a civil law system, which is similar to the system in France. And so all the rules are supposed to be found in the Civil Code of Quebec. Not everyone can see it, but I have with me a big brick here that it's basically kind of like the Bible. It's supposed to contain all the answers. And so all the laws are laid out in advance in the Civil Code of Quebec, which is based on the Napoleonic Code in France. The rest of Canada, on the other hand, has a common law system, and this is like the Disability Act added to the charter. The Canadian charter, they managed to have it added just before the charter was adopted. In Quebec, as was, the charter was actually in place for a few years before disability discrimination was added to offer that protection to people. So the charters are what we call the supreme laws. In other words, they sort of take precedence over all the other laws, and all the other laws in the province have to conform to the charter. The charters guarantee equality and freedom from discrimination, and their goal, according to the Supreme Court of Canada, is to remedy or prevent discrimination against groups subject to stereotyping, historical disadvantage, and political and social prejudice.
The point you had on the slide that people may not have seen is a good one in terms of the Canadian Charter, though, only has application to the government.
Thank you. That's the thing. Like I think that was about, how many hours? We started at 1, so I spoke for 2 hours straight right before this, and I also haven't really slept because I've been traveling constantly for the past few weeks. So please do mention, because that's incredibly important. So the Canadian Charter only applies to government laws and programs, so you can't basically file a discrimination complaint against an individual using the Canadian Charter. You would use the Quebec Charter. So the Quebec Charter applies to the government, but it also applies to private citizens and businesses and things like that. So each province and the federal level as well has its own human rights system. And these are what we call complaint-based systems. And what that means is that it's up to individuals who experience discrimination to file complaints. There's a whole system in place with a Human Rights Commission and a Human Rights Tribunal. So if you experience discrimination, you can file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission, which in Quebec is la Commission des droits des personnes et des droits de la jeunesse, or the CCDPJ. You'll see there's a lot of acronyms in this area of the law. It can be a bit overwhelming. So the role of the commission is basically to ensure that people's charter rights are respected, and they investigate all the complaints that are filed. The repeating function, I actually had the chance to edit a book a couple of years ago about all the different human rights systems in Canada. They're all quite similar. I think Ontario is the only one that has sort of restructured recently. But basically, when you file a complaint, with the commission. The commission has staff that will sort of investigate the complaint and get evidence from the person who's filing the complaint, get evidence from the person against the complaint is filed, and they will eventually make a decision about whether they are going to bring the complaint forward, basically accept it. And if they do, then they can represent you in front of the Human Rights Tribunal. So they will be your lawyers. Now, sadly, with this sort of the gatekeeping process, we don't actually see that many cases getting to the Human Rights Tribunal because they're weeded out either because the commission decides that there's not enough evidence of the discrimination. Often the commission will propose mediation, which is great. That means that you're sort of trying to find a settlement and avoiding having to go to court. But I don't think I mentioned this in the presentation. One of the drawbacks that I see to the mediation process is that the settlements are pretty much always confidential, which means that the next time someone comes forward with a similar issue, a similar complaint, they're basically having to reinvent the wheel all the time because you can't rely on that judgment from all the judgments issued by judges are open to the public and everyone can have access to them. Whereas if it's a mediation settlement, then it's confidential and it's only the information is only available to the parties involved. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but basically it means that if you're going through mediation all the time, then sadly the people who come after you are having to sort of start the whole process again without being able to use the previous ruling to help them out. So some basic principles of human rights law. We talked about discrimination. It's important to understand that discrimination need not be intentional. So basically you don't have to really mean to discriminate against someone. Maybe that wasn't your goal, but the way that you structured your service or your program actually ended up excluding people with disabilities, well, that's still considered discrimination. So, and people in Quebec and across Canada, and institutions also have a legal duty to accommodate people with disabilities up to the point of undue hardship. Now, what does undue hardship mean? That's a good question. It's sort of hard to pin down because it's assessed on a case-by-case basis. The courts take different factors into account, such as the cost of the accommodation and the size of the institution. So it sort of varies depending on the situation and the circumstances. We often hear about reasonable accommodations. In Quebec, we've heard about it a lot in the context of religion, but the same thing applies to people with disabilities. And the Human Rights Tribunal in Quebec has applied the concept of reasonable accommodations to different contexts, such as requiring hotels, restaurants, and bars to allow access to people using wheelchairs and service dogs. And I think I mentioned in the French presentation, sadly, it's kind of surprising that a lot of the cases that you see that make it to the Human Rights Tribunal are about people who have not allowed access to people using service dogs. And I think it is quite sad that, I think Laurence spoke in the 1970s that people were already trying to get this right respected. And in 2015, we're looking at people don't seem to understand that this is a legal obligation to allow access. I didn't read the actual provision in the charter, but in French, it's discrimination based on a disability, or I forget how they word it in English, but it means to sort of. It means to. That's how they translate. Okay, yeah. Palliate a disability, right? So a service dog or a cane or a wheelchair would be, that's it. It means to, I would say, accommodate. Palliate, but I think it's palliate. So the tribunal has also ruled that courts have to provide sign language interpreters for deaf people. And so this concept has been applied in a whole bunch of contexts. Last year, the Human Rights Commission in Quebec received over 800 complaints, and at 33%, disability-based discrimination was the largest category of complaints. So about 280 of those complaints were regarding disability-based discrimination. And this percentage has been fairly consistent over the years, and it's also similar in other provinces. So for whatever, well, I think we have some ideas of what the reasons are, but we're constantly seeing disability-based discrimination claims as sort of the highest number of complaints across the board. And the largest number of these disability complaints are regarding employment. So access to employment and accommodation in employment, and also complaints regarding goods and services, transportation in public spaces, and housing. So there are lots of critiques of this complaints-based human rights system. Like I said, it's a system that's in place across the board, but the delay can be incredibly long. I think the commission sort of gives itself up to 3 years to do the investigation of the complaint, but I know in some cases, there's at least one person here who has filed a complaint against the STM for the inaccessibility of the public transportation system in Montreal, and that complaint was filed in December of the phrase justice delayed is justice denied. I mean, no matter when the metro is made accessible, it's still going to be useful for people, but different kinds of accommodations, for example, in the workplace or in a classroom, if you're not actually getting the accommodation or the justice until 4 years down the road, it may not even really be able to help you out that much because the circumstances have changed by then. This kind of system also puts the burden on individuals to file these complaints. And people with disabilities, as we know, are already overburdened by the need to be constantly trying to navigate and overcome different barriers. And it also, I guess, I'll describe the image here. I have an image of a Band-Aid, because I kind of see it as sort of putting a Band-Aid, a small Band-Aid on this really huge wound. So disability discrimination is what we would do. Like the legal realm call a systemic problem. So it's not just like a problem that affects just a few people, it's really across the board in the whole way that society is structured, that it affects people's lives. And so I think we can't rely on an individual complaint-based system, and we need a more sort of a broader systemic solution. And I just got back from a really interesting conference in Ontario that was discussing their disability law that's been in place for 10 years. And one of the presenters had a great analogy of, never actually played this game, but there's a game called Whack-A-Mole. Has anyone heard of this? Where it's like, I think, I don't even know exactly how it works, but I think it's like these moles that keep popping their heads out of little holes and you have to try and hit them as they pop up. And that's sort of how I see individual accommodation. Because the more you just keep whacking at the moles, but they're just going to continuously keep popping up. And so you need to find some kind of solution to sort of block the moles completely rather than trying to find, like, putting little band-aids on this really easy problem. Is there a question or comment?
Yes. I think that the complaint system is based like for people who get like higher discrimination from someone or from that would make for systemic cases where many people could be seen for the same thing. More made for personal discrimination. Only the blue, I think.
Yeah, I think that is part of the problem. And so some provinces have come up with alternative solutions to address these sort of widespread problems, and disability discrimination is one such problem. So as we'll see, Quebec and Ontario have both adopted a law to promote accessibility, and we'll see though that one looks way better than the other. I'll let you guys judge for yourselves which one that is. Laurence spoke a little bit about what happened before the adoption of Quebec's law in 1978. Now, I haven't had anyone be able to explain to me why in Quebec we still use the term handicapped as opposed to disability or disabled. So there's actually language in the law that seems pretty outdated, because the law from 1978 is called an Act to Secure Handicapped People in the Exercise of Their Rights. And although a lot of groups were not happy with this law, as Laurence mentioned earlier, the law was considered cutting edge at the time in 1978. So as Laurence mentioned, it created a government disability office, which is known as the Office des Personnes Handicapées du Québec, or the OPHQ. It added handicap or disability to the Quebec Charter. And it also planned for the accessibility of sidewalks, parking, houses, public transportation, and telephone services. If we zoom out to look at some of the international developments during this time period, you can see that Quebec was actually ahead of its time in adopting this law in 1978. The United Nations declared 1981 to be the International Year of Disabled Persons, which later turned into the International Decade of Disabled Persons. But by developing this law in the 1970s, Quebec was actually a front runner in the field of disability law. Unfortunately, we completely lost our momentum and we no longer merit that title. So what's happened since 1978? In the year 2000, Quebec's construction code was updated to include accessibility requirements for buildings undergoing major renovations. However, these requirements only apply to the parts of buildings that are affected by the renovations, and they only require reasonable effort towards achieving accessibility. Now, what exactly reasonable efforts entail, I don't know. It's a very vague term, so it's hard to sort of measure whether that criteria has been reached or not. In 2004, Quebec's disability law was amended. This has a really long title. I mentioned earlier that no matter how many times I say it, I can never seem to memorize it, so I always have to read it. It's an act to secure handicapped people in the exercise of their rights with a view to achieving social, school, and workplace integration. So that is the law that's still in effect today. And an independent report on the implementation of the law has to be published every 5 years. That's written in the law. So oddly enough, I haven't been able to find any independent reports on the website of the OPHQ. One would think that that would be where you would go to get this information. But in doing a lot of searching on the internet a few years ago, I kind of accidentally stumbled upon the first independent report. It was like marked confidential all over it, so I'm not even sure whether it was supposed to be available on the public, but I have it. If you want it, let me know. I will give it to you. And so this report was published in 2012. I'm planning to submit an access to information request to sort of force the OPHQ to disclose whether there have been other reports and to actually make the report that I found widely accessible to the public. So the information that are my observations on the implementation of the law are drawn from that one report that I found from 2012. Unfortunately, I don't have any more recent data than that. The major changes in the amendments to the law in 2004 were that it significantly modified the role and responsibilities of this personne en statut Québec. The office's primary role is now advisory, basically. It advises the government on how laws and policies are supposed to or will affect people with disabilities. And the OPHQ also oversees the provincial disability policy, which was updated, I think, in 2009. I think it's practical in every respect, if I'm not mistaken. So the major innovation of the 2004 Act was the obligation imposed on the public sector to produce annual accessibility action plans. So government departments with over 50 employees and municipalities with over 1,500 inhabitants have to publicize annual action plans that describe the measures that they have adopted in the past year to reduce barriers.
Sorry, no,
yeah.
1,500 or 15,000?
15,000, thank you very much. Yep, I told you, like I said, I'm very tired, so please do point this out because they're important, important facts. So over 50 employees and over 15,000 inhabitants. So you can see that would exclude the smaller towns. And so basically they have to deposit this plan describing the measures they've adopted in the past year and the measures they intend to adopt in the upcoming year to reduce the barriers facing people with disabilities. However, and I'll describe the image here, there's a judge that's sort of like waving his hand in disapproval. So basically, this law is not efficient because it has no penalties. It doesn't impose penalties if the government departments don't submit their accessibility plans. And even if the departments do submit a plan, it does not require the departments to actually follow through with the plan. So you could basically write whatever you want in your plan, and nothing's going to happen if you don't respect it. Also, as I mentioned earlier, this obligation only applies to the public sector, so government, departments, ministries, municipalities. So there's no obligation on the private sector, which includes restaurants and stores and things like this, services that people would be relying on a daily basis. So hopefully this obligation gets the government thinking about accessibility, but probably not necessarily doing anything concrete about it. Now, some of the most important provisions in this law from 2004, we'll see, have not unfortunately really had a significant effect. When you look at public transportation, the law from 2004 obliged all public transit agencies to submit an accessibility plan by 2005. However, as of 2011, only 16 out of 34 of these agencies had actually submitted a plan. Once again, there's like no penalty if you don't follow through with this. There's no enforcement. And I don't think I have the slide here, but you may be familiar with the inaccessibility of the public transit system in Montreal. So the metro at this rate is supposed to be fully accessible by approximately 2029, even more. We'll see in Ontario, they're aiming to make it fully accessible by 2025. So when I presented this before, people think that I'm joking when I say 2090, but it's the sad truth. And if we look at public buildings, so this is buildings that are open to the public, but that are sort of run through the government. So we're talking about hospitals, medical clinics, schools, these types of things. So in 2006, the Minister of Labour was supposed to submit a report on the accessibility, sort of evaluating the accessibility of these public buildings. And in 2007, the Minister was supposed to determine by regulation which categories of buildings had to be made accessible. Well, the report was submitted in June of 2008, so 2 years late, and it found that the average degree of accessibility of these buildings was approximately 54%. Now, when you're thinking that this is important services like medical services, hospitals, and schools, this is really quite unsettling. And to date, no regulations have been enacted. So the regulations were supposed to be enacted in 2007. We're now 2015, and there's been nothing done here. And I have my image of the judge, again, waving his hand in disapproval, basically saying that this law is not efficient because there are no penalties for non-compliance. So if you're not punished for not obeying the law, sadly, people don't really seem to be too enthusiastic about fulfilling their obligations. So let's see how Quebec measures up when we're compared to our neighbors in Ontario. I know that maybe the more francophone side of Quebec is sometimes reluctant to look at Ontario as an example, but I think we actually can learn a lot by looking at what's going on in other provinces and even other countries. So in Ontario, there was a long and strong grassroots campaign to obtain a strong disability law to promote accessibility in the province. So I think it was about 10 years at least that people were really focused on pushing for this law. And in 2001, the government adopted the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. I think my acronyms in this area. So this 2001 law is commonly known as the AODA. And this law basically really resembles the law that we have in place here in Quebec, in that it only applies to the public sector, so the government agencies, that it focuses on accessibility plans, and that it lacks efficient enforcement mechanisms. And so how did the disability community in Ontario respond to this law? They were really disappointed because they had worked so hard for so long to really see some real change, and they were not satisfied. They knew that this law was not going to be sufficient, basically, to bring about real change. So after the 2003 elections, they pressured the new government for a much stronger law, and they were successful. In 2005, the government in Ontario adopted the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, another acronym, the AODA. I've heard people call it AODA, that might be a bit easier. So the goal of this law, and this is written in black and white in the law, that is to make the province fully accessible by 2025. This is really a very ambitious goal. It's questionable whether the goal will be met, but you can see significant process, and at least that's it. There is a goal. Unlike Quebec, where we don't even have a date in mind here. So the 2005 law from Ontario applies to all people and organizations in the public and private sectors. So it's not only the government that has responsibilities, it's individual citizens and businesses as well, which I think is key. So the law plans for the development of accessibility standards in different areas. And so far, 5 accessibility standards have been enacted. Now, the development of each of these standards has been a pretty long process. So I know not everyone is satisfied with the pace at which things are changing in Ontario, but it's important to keep in mind that some of the standards, they're really technical, like for information. Well, I'll explain first what the standards are. There have been 5 so far. The first one was customer service. And then there's the integrated accessibility standards, which include information and communications, employment, transportation, and the design of public spaces, or what we call the built environment. Now, just to clarify right off the bat, that the public spaces standard doesn't actually apply to buildings. It's the areas outside of buildings. So that includes, for example, parks, beaches, things like this. I've heard some really great examples of improvements that have been made in this area. So buildings themselves are addressed similar to in Quebec. They're addressed through the building code. There are accessibility requirements in the building code in Ontario that are quite similar to the standards here, in that they only apply to new buildings or to buildings undergoing major renovations. But I know people are really dissatisfied with that, and so they're really pushing to have some kind of obligation to make existing buildings accessible, at least where it's not really a big deal. Often we see just a small step, for example, in front of a building where it would be so easy to make it accessible. So I think what's been done elsewhere, sometimes like forcing people to take sort of easy steps, or no pun intended, sorry, but like to kind of make an effort to make things accessible if it wouldn't be difficult to do so. So it's important to keep in mind that these 5 standards that are in place in Ontario right now are gradually being implemented. So they didn't all come into force in 2005 when the law was enacted. They're only starting to be implemented now. The customer service standard, which was the first standard, only came into effect in the private sector, for example, in 2012. And a lot of the key obligations, for example, in transportation and information and communications, are going to be starting to come into effect this year. But it's a pretty complicated system because there's different dates, different deadlines of organizations. So, for example, the obligations come into effect earlier for the government and then later for companies, I guess, to give businesses more time to sort of prepare themselves for these obligations. And it also depends on the size of the organization. So again, they want to take factors like costs and stuff, take that into account. So I would say it's really too early to know the real impact that these regulations are going to have on the ground, because, like I said, some of the obligations aren't actually in effect. But as we can discuss maybe in the question period, I just attended this conference in Ontario where people were giving me concrete examples of how they could already see significant changes on the ground because of this law and these regulations. So as I mentioned, the obligations are phased in gradually. There's also an independent review of the law every 3 years. In Quebec, it's every 5 years. The difference is in Ontario, they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. And so you can go online and easily find the 2 independent reports that have been completed so far. And there's some really interesting recommendations. I got to meet with the dean of the law faculty at Oxford Hall or something that they wrote the most recent report. And so there's some really good things that we can learn from here and working towards improving our own system. And Ontario is in the process of developing other standards. Right now, they're looking at education and healthcare. People are really pushing to have a standard on accessible housing because it's so hard to find accessible places to live. Now, one of the most important things about the law in Ontario is that there's really strong enforcement mechanisms. So not only do people and organizations, both private and public, have to publicize annual accessibility reports, like in Quebec, in Ontario, the law foresees inspections to make sure that people are actually complying with the law. And what they call accessibility directors have the power to issue orders, basically like forcing people to comply with the law if they're found to be in violation of the law. And they can also impose significant financial penalties. Yeah, it's kind of a sad state of affairs that I say money talks, because as we see in Quebec, without any kind of penalty, we see that the law is not really being respected. Whereas in Ontario, there's definitely the potential to see some significant change, because if people don't comply with their obligations, then they can be fined up to $50,000 a day for individuals and $100,000 a day for businesses. So it's very expensive for them not to comply, which means it's strong incentive to actually fulfill their obligations. Now, since I started doing this research several years ago, there have actually been a lot of other changes taking place around the country. In 2013, the Manitoba government adopted Manitobans Act, which was really inspired by the AODA in Ontario, and they're in the process of developing accessibility standards as we speak, starting with a customer service standard. British Columbia and Nova Scotia are sort of following in their footsteps, and they're currently working on developing a law. I know British Columbia has a policy right now saying that they plan to make their province accessible by 2024. So they're trying to one-up Ontario by 2025. So let's see, maybe Quebec can do 2023. Can we do it? Can we do it? And if we look to our neighbors down south, this I would call the pioneers of accessibility, basically, because I mentioned earlier, it's really rare that I will compliment American law or policy, but in this area, I would say they were really ahead of the game. They adopted the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, and this is the world's first comprehensive disability law. And the ADA prevents discrimination in employment, government services, which includes transportation, private businesses that serve the public, and telecommunications. And it happens to be the 25th anniversary of the ADA this summer, so I know there's a lot of celebrations going on all over the states. If you want more information, just you can scroll through the internet, lots of stuff going on. So under the ADA, courts can award compensation and impose penalties of up to $100,000 for violations. And again, this gives people a strong incentive to comply. Now, I know there are some cultural differences. The States tends to be seen as more litigious, like people are more prone to filing lawsuits against their neighbors. So that could be part of what contributed to seeing the change on the ground. But, you know, the ADA is maybe far from perfect. I'm not an expert. I haven't lived in the States, but I know that surveys have found that the majority of Americans with disabilities really do feel like this law has changed their lives. And I came across, because it's the 25th anniversary this summer, there's a website that someone started where people can contribute. I think it's a list of 25 ways in which the ADA has improved my life. And so people are really seeing the impact of having this strong law. And I have some friends who use wheelchairs who have traveled to the States, and they basically said, I don't want to come home because they see such a huge difference where it's just, someone in the earlier session was talking about, it's almost total freedom. Like, you just don't really have to be thinking and planning about, well, will I be able to get into this place? Because there is such a higher level of accessibility, and I think just public awareness. And so, yeah, makes a huge difference. Yes, actually, that's what I was going to say. It does. I mean, you have to keep in mind that it differs depending on what city you're in and probably what state you're in as well. But the ADA is a federal law, so it applies sort of across the board, which I know has made a big difference, for example, in transportation services. So there's already been a lot of information, so I'll finish just by giving a few quick recommendations for law reform in Quebec. These are pretty basic recommendations, but I think it's a good place for government to start. First of all, I would suggest that we extend obligations to the private sector, because as we saw in Quebec, it's only the government and government agencies that really even have to be doing anything to do with accessibility at the moment. So the private sector should have to also submit accessibility plans and establish guidelines for providing services for people with disabilities. So many of the barriers that people with disabilities face on a daily basis are in the private sector. For example, like just getting into being able to have access to an office building that you work in, for example, is like pretty basic, but also being able to take part in different social and recreational activities, just like everyone else. If you can't get in the door, or you can't read a menu, for example, then you're really limited in the activities you can partake in. So, for example, the customer service standard in Ontario really obliges businesses to train their employees in sort of the different types of accommodations that people might need. And I think really just sensitization, is that a word in English? I'm getting French and English all jumbled now. But basically increasing public awareness and just making people aware of what some of the issues might be would be a really good place to start. I think it's also critical to establish deadlines and targets for the removal of barriers. As I mentioned, Ontario has set the goal of 2025 to make the province accessible. BC has mentioned 2024. We don't have a date here. The metro is supposed to be fully accessible, I think, by 2029. So maybe that could be our proud achievement to make accessible province by 2090. Even if we don't succeed in reaching whatever goal we set, I think at least by having the goal, it sort of gives us something to work towards, and it inspires us and sort of creates an incentive. So these goals have to be realistic and take things like cost into account. I think that's partly why Ontario has chosen this sort of rolling implementation model, where the obligations come into effect gradually. Finally, I think, well, it goes without saying that unless you have enforcement mechanisms that make sure that people are actually respecting and obeying the law, then it doesn't really do that much good to have things written down on paper if you can't ensure that people are actually going to be following through with their obligations. So, like Ontario, we could have an independent body doing investigations. We've talked a lot about the Disabilities Quebec. This could be, for example, a role that they could take on. I know Laurence was mentioning people were worried that the OPHQ would turn into this basically a giant bureaucracy that could kind of create an additional barrier for people with disabilities. From what I had sort of observed, that does seem to have been the case. And so this would be sort of a useful, very useful thing that the OPHQ could do. To enforce the law, we have to have penalties to make sure that people are actually well, punished is a strong word, but that's it, to sort of make sure that people fulfill their obligations. And in Ontario, because they're quite a bit ahead of the game, with this conference I attended last week, they're talking about accessibility champions. So celebrating people who actually exceed their legal obligations. Here we're like, you've been trying to get them to respect them in the first place, right? But there are places in Ontario where yeah, people are going above and beyond what their obligations are, and I think it's important to try and celebrate that, and maybe give them tax incentives and things like this to motivate people to get on board. So, in Quebec, I know we can be better, and in fact, I would say we have a legal and a moral duty to do so. We even have lots of examples now on how we can improve the current situation. So I think we need to build a grassroots campaign to advocate for legislative reform. We need to get more people on board to build momentum to push for real change. This is what we saw in other provinces, and that's it. It takes a long time. It's daunting, but it is doable. We need to make a firm commitment to promoting the equality that's already guaranteed in the charters of rights and freedoms. So we have this equality on paper, but we don't need to have equality really in people's day-to-day lives. The law is not sort of a perfect solution that's going to fix everything overnight. I do realize that, but as we've seen in other places, people do express how it has made a significant change in their daily lives. And I would say that without enforceable legal obligations, we're really not seeing very much progress in terms of accessibility. So I invite you all to join us in the movement to create a more accessible Quebec. We all have a role to play in breaking down the barriers facing people with disabilities. So that's about it for the presentation, but people have questions or comments. We had some good discussions in the earlier session, so I'm curious to hear people's thoughts. And also, I'm tiredness aside, so I may have missed some points today, but I'd really like to hear people's feedback as well. Like, I don't know, we have a website if people want to send us an email. If anything I was saying was not clear, every time I give the presentation, I try to sort of simplify things more and more so that it's easier for people to take in the information, because there's a lot of information. So if you have any suggestions about how I could do that better, please, I invite you to do so. Yeah. Oui,
From what you've read,
yeah,
or what you've heard, either about ODA or ADA,
yeah,
what would you exclude in Quebec's version? What were the pitfalls, maybe, that at least there's a positive about being late?
well, that's the thing. I was kind of joking about this when I presented at the conference in Ontario the other day. I guess that's an advantage of being far behind everyone else, is that you have lots of examples to choose from, right? You can learn from people's mistakes and the things they're doing well. I would say, I mean, it was interesting. The person who drafted the second independent report on the law in Ontario recently presented at this conference last week, and she was saying, now she has, I believe, a bachelor's and master's and PhD in some other subject, and then a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in law, and she's the dean of, I think, Oxford Hall Law School. And she said, with all those degrees, we still have trouble figuring out which obligations apply to who when. And I thought, oh, huge, actually, because it was like ripping my hair out trying to figure it out. She actually, at the end of her report, there's an appendix with like a chart of which obligations sort of come into effect when, but it's incredibly complex. And I understand the reasoning for that. It was to have this rolling implementation so that you're not sort of overwhelming institutions by sort of overnight imposing these really strong obligations on them. So it was to sort of give people the time to sort of ease into it. But in the end, what I seem to be hearing is that it's maybe overburdening them in a different way, in terms of having it be so difficult to figure out what their obligations are, that, I mean, it's a disincentive again for people to comply. It's overly complicated to figure out their obligations. So in terms of what, I mean, I think we can learn from that in terms of what like a better solution would be. You know, that's, I think we're got to brainstorm some ideas, because the ADA in the States, it's been around for so much longer. The structure is quite different. If I'm not mistaken, I think the obligations, I think pretty much all came into effect immediately. So back in 1990. I'm not an expert, so I'm not sure. But so I think, I don't know, it would be sort of drawing on all these things, but I would say keep it simple and understandable when you're setting deadlines. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What would you suggest for someone who more people with disabilities, either they're very much advocates and they're really, I'm going to extremes here, but for example, Maria, who was administrating you, she was amazing and she was very much an advocate.
Oh, Maria Berlin, yes, yeah.
Then there's other people who kind of fall on the other end of the spectrum. So like, things like so bad, or even if they are, can't really be changing. So I guess my question would be, how would you motivate those people? Or is there anything that to get? What was that? What's that question?
Yeah, no, but it's a really good question, and I mean, I think started, there's not that many of us in the room here, but I think it is events like this and giving people the information, because I think once you have this information, it's sort of hard to ignore it and say, whoa, okay, other places are doing so much better, and there are ways that we could do this without that much difficulty. And so I would say that's it, like increasing the awareness. I know there does seem to be a difference in the cultural difference, and I'm sort of reluctant to say this, but the Francophone, Anglophone divide, I don't know, historically I think there's been a lot more disability rights activism in the Anglophone community. I think in the photo that Laurence showed at the beginning of her presentation of Maria Barilli, actually, at a protest, I think it was in the 80s. I'm not sure if she mentioned that it was a lot of people that had come from the States to participate in these demonstrations. So there's a sort of mentality, a difference in mentality, and I don't have an answer to why that is. I mentioned earlier, if I were to pursue a PhD or something, that would be a really interesting topic, but I still don't even know if I could come up with an answer. Because there's been a lot of militants in Quebec for other issues, and I understand the reluctance to rock the boat, so to speak, when you're reliant on the state for so many services, but that is the same case wherever you live. And so I don't know why there seems to be more reluctance here than I have seen elsewhere, but like I said, I'm hoping that this is sort of the beginning. There seems to be a growing awareness and a growing movement in the past few years, which I find really encouraging. It's very small, but our goal here today is really, that's it, to get the information out there, to get people on board, and maybe you guys can spread the word. I think that's how it works.
This is sort of like in Ontario. This is very much a political campaign more than a legal one. I mean, really, you have to go convince your MPP to, get behind it. That's about the only thing, that, certainly that was the approach in Ontario. It took many elections and two governments and two versions of the law to get there, but,
well, they're still fighting. It's really sad. I mean, it would be nice to think that, okay, now you've got the law, and so now it's all resolved. And not to discourage people, but I'm seeing that you still need to keep putting on that pressure, and it's exhausting, right? It's like what I was talking about filing complaints with the Human Rights Commission. If you're already having such difficulty, like getting access to things to begin with, how much energy do you have left over to be waging these battles on a daily basis? So that's where I think, for example, the OPHQ could come in, where I think that this should be a battle that they are waging. Their goal is supposed to be to promote the rights of people with disabilities, and so they should be advocating on behalf of these kinds of things, at least as well as sort of the disability community more broadly. But you're right, talking about elections and stuff, that's what I observed as a really big strategy in Ontario, was to get politicians during their election campaigns to actually concretely make commitments to accessibility, about adopting a law within a certain period of time, for example, and they would get these commitments in writing, and therefore once the whichever political party won the election, then they would have those commitments in writing and use them to pressure the government and sort of, I don't know, I might say shaming sort of, but some interesting and sort of fun strategies. For example, they would have birthday parties every year or whatever, celebrating, okay, it's been 1 year since you failed to fulfill your obligations, and they would have a big birthday party with a giant birthday cake in front of City Hall. So, there are some, we have a lot of examples that we can follow. There's been some clever things, but I think the key is you have to be consistent.
The classic hybrid where we found online, I'm wondering if you could possibly do a Mr. Copy on, I know there's a Facebook event.
Yeah, so we've started a website. It's a very new organization. That's something else that's difficult, trying to really make change, because you've got all these different organizations basically focusing on different types of disabilities, but all with different approaches, and then you've got the citywide, provincial, federal. It gets very complicated. So I think that this new initiative is Quebec Accessible. We're sort of trying to just be a I don't know if it would be a coalition or something, but to just sort of be a place where people can go for resources and sort of bringing all these groups together. So we're going to hopefully be posting our PowerPoint slides, and but I think that's not accessible to everyone, so it may take me a while, but I was going to create a Word document with all of this information as well. I was hoping to have handouts today. I realized I had to pick up some brochures and stuff in Ontario, and I was going to put together some documentation for people to take home. I did not have the chance, but this the website is
quebecaccessive.wordpress.com. So we're going to post this, the classified document. I don't know how if you can post it. But
yeah,
if
I'll look
you
into
get-
legally what the ramifications are, because since it should be a public document. Yeah.
They posted it there.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to send it to your website.
Yeah.
Yes, you can include it in comments.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
We'll figure it out.
Whatever.
Yeah.
There's nothing that the state really should keep confidential from the citizenry within.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Are you gonna add something about that?
Not just really excited about both they have to be like
Yeah.
no competition and for my own experience. So that like it seems like punish people like strong, you know, like discriminations, like for like people like one want to have confirmation, not to be like
Mm.
but I think it's just one negative answer to
Yeah.
that question. I know them all.
Yeah.
But I feel that a lot of it and as we talk about the French presentation that one of our objectives is to like share that knowledge with the movement, because one of the problems that we are facing at the time is that the organizations that are working for like this foreign times are not really working towards like a change of the legislation, and some of them told me that because they don't follow the regulation is mostly regulation or is creating, as Melanie said that she's a lawyer and she has some to understand it, so for most people it's just not that difficult. I feel like one of our priorities is to make that knowledge available as we like possible, and like you have to make them more open that the disability rights that this is a big fight, that this is no big, that's the only fight, but it's not big. And I'm going to tell you that what I've seen that disability is not recognized in this way. Like there's a lot of disability organizations that are like this funding from the government. We have really close ties with the government sometimes. They're not necessarily have over here in the world to obtain, and it's really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a tricky question because I know, for example, so I'm a new lawyer. I've been a lawyer only since December, but I really want to work in the area of disability law. For example, there's nowhere to do that in Quebec. So in Toronto, there's the Arts Disability Law Center that's existed for, I think, like over 30 years. They get 95% of their funding from legal aid. Now, I've been told, I don't really understand the nuances, but I've been told the legal aid structure is different in Quebec and Ontario. And so I guess Quebec would not fund a sort of a legal clinic focused on one sort of specific issue. But for example, I mean, they get their funding from legal aid, which ultimately comes from the government, and they're still criticizing the government all the time. So it's still like, yeah, should be possible. Did anyone want to talk
I think it's
about?
probably easier for an organization like that to go after the government, when that's what they're set up to do.
Right.
As opposed to independent living or something like that, which gets grants from the government and probably doesn't want to go out on a limb and risk their neck on that.
Right.
And the AS plan, but more importantly, there's so many relations that every have their own relation, their own mission, right? So for us, for example, if people choose the information for them to do what they want, and if it's not for, there's so many nuances, there's so many errors and things. And I think there's also the aspect of how do you then, why treat it like people, and what are the society. There was a bit of a screening of this documentary in France. Well, I'm not going to give it a stronger word, but Benard and Laurence, which is in France, and I think France has not a lawyer, so please excuse me, I don't have the right. No, but they have a law there where their goal is also to have everything feasible by 2025. And they had some business owners who were saying it's just not possible. We're going like for business. So I think there's so many different aspects to it. This is super interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, it's not an easy thing to do to try to sort of come up with a solution, but if we don't even attempt to start, this is the problem.
Yeah.
It's like if we're just sort of playing around. I don't know if I mentioned in this presentation that I had the opportunity to meet with the lawyer from the OPSG that actually helped drafted the law from 2004. And so, I mean, the law that is really sort of having a big effect in Ontario is law from 2005, and we adopted our law in 2004. So he was saying, well, our law was actually pretty good. Like, we did do research looking at other places before we adopted this law. It was pretty good. But I think it's really in the past decade that things have been moving a lot more quickly. So, in 2004, it might have been acceptable, sort of, compared to what was going on elsewhere. For example, the law in 2001 from Ontario. But since then, a lot of things have happened. So I do intend to sort of follow up with this lawyer, not that he has the power himself to sort of be changing things, but at least so he's aware and he's got the information. Because, this research that I've been doing is really pretty basic stuff, but it was not available out there. First of all, disability law is not really on the agenda in law schools here. There's no disability studies programs in Quebec. And so, just even trying to get access to this information, there's nothing that's really been written about this. So, sort of starting from scratch.
Does it has kind of a plan in terms of, like, there's going to be a petition on a website where we can add our names to say that we believe in such a law here, which we would call it Wakab. But, and then I don't know if it's the same thing in Ottawa, but here in Quebec, if you have enough signatures, then you need to find an elected that will drive this petition and present it to the Assemblée Nationale. But then we might want to wait, not just to have the sufficient amount, but an overall, like a huge amount of names. Like, so what do you, I guess there's one, not say okay. I was going to say ladies, but there are at least one guy there in the fives. Do you have a plan, or are you still thinking about what's next after we have, let's say, created a spirit?
I like the idea we're assuming that we're going to create a spirit. That's great.
Not have a plan. But it's sort of like an initiative, and we are given. And I think that the objective of today was to have an idea of the interest and how people in the island who want to be involved in that movement. And I feel like we're being like careful, and we don't want to,
Typical Quebec.
young people. I think we don't want to have a attitude. And you can't just like, let them do our skin, but we just want to be sure. And we have the tools, and we have the arguments, because we have the So I think that so when there's a meeting on Wednesday, and there's going to be a petition launch to promote like the law. this way with other people that decided to do that. And when we did that, we were like, oh my god, really? That's really fast. I think you go, and we're like, not really, but can you help us? It doesn't happen like that. Human beings, so sometimes I guess maybe that tradition either popular and we can use that. We are working with this, but nothing that we want to push is as a hospital. Right, so they know what is happening, so they can get information as a
Yeah, there's been, like I said, interesting strategies in Ontario, like we have changed names a few times over the past like 2 decades, but basically the organization that's been really that's played a really important role in pushing for this law and now pushing for the implementation. They've developed like toolkits, action kits that they've made accessible on their website and they've emailed out to people. So for example, templates with letters that people can bring to their MPs and sort of different strategies and yeah, sort of some arguments and facts that they can bring if they're talking to the media. So, and I think there are already organizations in Montreal that have been doing a lot of this work over the past few years. Some of us were part of the CAPIC, l'Association des activistes pour l'inclusion au Québec, and now Montreal Inaccessible. Accessible Life Montreal. Sorry. There's so much. That's just what I mean. There's so many initiatives, but they all sort of have slightly different goals. So,
and more approach by disabilities and inclusion today, and they want to use the ways. So, but that's very that they are.
well, I didn't have the chance to tell about this before, but so it was pretty exciting at the conference I was at in Ontario. I mean, Ottawa, which is where I grew up, actually, was in an interesting situation because you're literally like right on the border. You can walk across to Quebec in like 2 minutes. And so, in Ottawa University of Ottawa is francophone and anglophone. And so I met some people that are working there and some francophones in Ottawa. Somehow they'd actually heard about this presentation. So then they said, oh yeah, there's some event going on Saturday, and this is like people in Gatineau, and they're like, and I said, yeah, that's me actually. How did you hear about that? So like the word is spreading. I guess this is the role of technology. I'm kind of a technophobe. My cell phone that just broke when I fell was actually my first cell phone, believe it or not. I only had it for a month. But so I know when technology is accessible, it can be a really great tool for that, keeping people informed of things that are going on. So when I said that everyone has a role to play, I think that's it. Because the people that are here today, they can spread the word to some of their peers and sort of get more people at least interested in getting informed. That's the place to start.
I think that because we are a movement that exists, we are involved with that. Well, for myself, but I feel always like I want to offend people, like you want to join your goals, and not like.
Yeah, not to alienate people. Do you mean other disabilities or people in general? Yeah,
that we, I mean, not all the same thing. So, the needs about computers connect. Are those things?
Yeah, not stepping on anyone's toes, really, just sort of creating a space where people can hopefully come together when they're working towards the same goal.
And also the reasons why we decided to do this and why we found that name for that inclusion. We had to find a name, and it's also because we are often, media like to talk with us, and using this in disability inspiration stories that happening in Montreal. So we are often like, oh, we have one person coming, this is the stories, and problem that we have right now. We have an entity like a name, and it's also like a lot of people will really are like level, but visible for you. So I think that's very important. And so we try as much as possible to talk about that law, even though we're not really sure what to want exactly. So I think that's good. Like, I would like to know who are people with disabilities, right? So like I was encourage people to start talking about it. And then have to know everything what we want with main features because I think that is pretty clear. That's a lot of
Well, that's the thing. I mean, even I'm a lawyer, but it's like I don't pretend to be able to come up with a perfect solution for overnight. I know when the petition that's going to be circulating, I think starting next week, they were thinking they had to actually come up with like a draft, an example of the law. And I'm like, whoa, no. Like, we're just trying to get the conversation started at this point. And yeah, down the road, once people realize that it's something that needs to be done, that's it. We're sort of, we've got the information, looking at what's going on out there, and just learn from that.
I guess I would like to time and for always finding people and difficult. Is that accessible?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's it. I don't know if Maviek wasn't introduced here, but Maviek has been working a lot behind the scenes, getting today organized and helping with translations.
And it was streamed live. I believe that it was possible, but
I figured it out.
Yay! Yeah, so you know people who weren't able to make it today, apparently it's going to be available on YouTube. It is available on YouTube.
Yep.
That's not scary, yes. But so you can send them the link, and as I said, we're going to put our slides and hopefully some Word documents with this information. So, and I don't know, I was kind of hoping we discussed having maybe a series of these kinds of events, because this was just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Now that I've been in Ontario and had the chance to ask a lot of questions, I have more information about concretely what's going on there. And so, for example, there could be a whole discussion just about that and about what some of these accessibility like.
Next up.
I need to sleep in it. So yeah, stay tuned. To be continued.